us today at this session titled The ROK-US Alliance Changes, Challenges, Opportunities. A simultaneous interpretation for our participants here at the venue will be provided. For Korean, it is channel 5, and for English, it is channel 6 on your receivers. I think the moderator of this session needs no introduction, especially here in Korea, but as the MC, please allow me to officially introduce the moderator. Ambassador Kathleen Stevens was a career diplomat in the United States Foreign Service from 1978 to 2015. She was the United States Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011, the first woman and first Korean speaker to serve in that position. She has recently assumed the position as President and CEO of Korea Economic Institute America in September 2018. And with that said, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Kathleen Stevens, the chair of Pacific Century Institute, with a very warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everyone. It is great to be back in Korea, and especially to be back at the Jeju Forum. I've missed it for the last couple of years, and it's a great honor for me to be back here with all of you. And in particular, as some of you could see as we sat down, with a group of colleagues who we all know each other quite well. And it's good to see everybody face to face. I am very pleased to lead a discussion, or moderate a discussion, I should say. I'll try to keep my interventions to a minimum, but poke me if I don't, on the U.S., or the ROK-US Alliance, Changes, Challenges, Opportunities. I noticed, since you mentioned that I read some Korean, that the challenges was actually translated as 과제, which kind of means issues, I guess. But, but I think whether they're issues or challenges, there's always lots of challenges, changes, and opportunities in the U.S.-Korea relationship. But perhaps now, more than ever, in many ways, in terms of their complexity and their newness. Of course, changes such as the transfers of power in our respective countries over the last 2 years, in our heads of government and our presidents. In some ways, although many of us are here, well, thanks to the Pacific Century Institute, that I think we're in a century now, or in a decade now, where we see the lines between the Pacific security and Atlantic security blurring in ways that have huge implications for the U.S.-Korea alliance, and beyond, of course. We see the lines between traditional economic and security issues blurring and intermingling in a way that's quite new in my experience. And we see an emphasis on multilateralism, which is, I think, in both countries, which also, I think, has implications. Having said I wasn't going to say anything first, I did that, but my real job is to just try to warm this up and kick it off, and it's my pleasure to do so by introducing our 4 panelists, all of whom I think are very, very well known to those who do follow alliance affairs here in Korea as well as in the United States. So I will be brief. Their fuller biographies are in the forum program. I'm going to introduce them in the order I'm going to ask them to make some initial comments, and we will start quite appropriately with former Korean diplomat and former First Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Korea, the Honorable Im Sung-nam, who was First Vice Foreign Minister from 2015 to 2018. Throughout his 40-year career as a diplomat for the Republic of Korea, he has led policy on the most important and sensitive issues, I have to say, in probably South Korea's foreign policy. Of course, the relationship with the United States. He's been deeply involved also with our efforts and South Korea's efforts vis-a-vis North Korea, security cooperation, relations with Japan, and a few more. So we look forward to his overview today and to our conversation. I'm then going to turn to, we have panelists from both sides of the Pacific, from the US and from Korea, to Spencer Kim, a friend of mine, I'll say an old friend, but only in the best possible way. We've known each other for a long time. He's chairman and CEO of Seaball Corporation in the United States, founder of the Pacific Century Institute, with which I'm so pleased to be associated, and very, very active in US-Korean relations over the years, and supporting so many business, people-to-people ties, and efforts to bring our alliance even closer. I'm then going to turn to Professor John Delury, whom I first met when I was ambassador here. I think that's when he moved to Korea, about a decade ago now. He was a young professor then, he's still a young professor now, and he's a professor of Chinese studies at Yonsei University. at the Graduate School of International Studies. He's also the chair of International Studies at the Underwood International College. He's the co-author, along with a great American China scholar, another great American China scholar, Orville Schell, of Wealth and Power, China's Long March to the 21st Century. You wrote it almost a decade ago, but it's still, I think, worth dusting off, and I've referred to it very recently. And then we will ask Song Jie, who I think is well known here in Korea to many of you, to be our fourth speaker. She is now a professor, again, at the Graduate School of International Studies, but this time at Ewha Women's University. She was for 15 years CNN's bureau chief and correspondent in Seoul from 1995 to 2010. She's done a variety of things since then, including a couple of government positions. You had to work for the government eventually, at what we used to call the Blue House. And leading the Korea International Broadcasting Foundation, which runs and gets the Arirang TV and radio. So a great group here to start this discussion, and I'm going to turn now to Ambassador Im to start us off.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for a very generous introduction. And I would like to welcome Kathy as well as Spencer for having come a long way to join this important forum. I think I should kick off by touching upon the change in the Korea-US alliance first, so that the discussion can be launched. I think the biggest difference or the biggest change in the Korea-US alliance can be the fact that, say, in comparison with the year 2002, which was about 20 years ago, I believe that the Korea-US alliance suffered, for instance, through an incident of the killing of two junior high school girl students, Hyosun and Misun incident. And that incident itself was a setback and also symbolized how negative the alliance itself was back then. And we also had some controversies surrounding the Korea-US FTA, and we also had other low points in the bilateral relationship. But over the past 20 years, I think we were able to overcome those difficult problems, and we were able to solve all those issues. And all in all, I believe that the Korea-US alliance couldn't be in a better shape. If I look at the recent poll, 9 out of 10 Koreans support the Korea-US alliance. And in the case of the public mood in the Washington vis-a-vis the Republic of Korea, in the scale of 100, the Americans liked the Republic of Korea at the level of 60, which was quite high. And that was the survey done in 2020. So all in all, the alliance itself is in a good shape. And let me look at the domestic landscape for the bilateral relationship. For instance, in the case of the Republic of Korea, now I don't see any meaningful difference between conservatives and liberals as far as the importance of the Korea-US alliance is concerned. Earlier this year, the two major presidential candidates, Mr. Yoon and the then Governor Lee, submitted the article, respectively, to Foreign Affairs, outlining their foreign policy vision. And their emphasis upon the importance of the Korea-US alliance as a backbone of the security of the Republic of Korea was almost identical. If you compare those two articles, in particular the sections on the Korea-US alliance, you could not really find any meaningful difference. And President Moon Jae-in and President Biden adopted a very meaningful and very positive joint statement in May last year. And that was, in a sense, succeeded by a similar version of the joint statement between President Biden and President Yoon in May this year. So as far as the domestic landscape for the Korea-US alliance in the Republic of Korea is concerned, I think now there is a strong or robust element of consensus and continuity about the importance of the bilateral relationship. But on the other hand, I believe we are concerned about the possibility that Washington's Republic of Korea policy could flip-flop depending upon the outcome of their presidential elections. I don't have to go into detail with regard to what happened in the bilateral relationship, say 4 years ago, but how to secure the continuity, how to secure the consistency, now not on the Korean side, but on the US side, could be a bigger challenge. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. Spencer.
Good afternoon. President Yoon recently announced his plan toward North, and he called it the Audacious Plan. And big incentive for North Koreans to be able to come toward this offer. And in return, they will have to give up their nuclear weapons. And there's really nothing wrong with that plan, except I am not sure whether that's realistic. For it to be realistic, North Korea has to believe that South Korea will follow through all of those details that they will promise to deliver. And all of that will have to be delivered in 5 years during the term of President Yoon. Who believes that President Yoon has an agreement with the next president of South Korea to detail his plan, what kind of things will be given to North, and how it will be paid for, what is agreed schedule of denuclearization? Actually, not just the next president, probably next few presidents as well. And then finally, the National Assembly has to agree to that, because since they hold the money. South Korean presidents are elected for single terms of 5 years, and US presidents are elected for 4 years with a maximum of 2 terms. The South Korean National Assembly is often not controlled by the party of president. So in his reign, Kim Jong-un has already dealt with 3 US presidents and 4 South Korean presidents. And he's only 39, so that means he probably will be governing for next 40 years or so. South Korean or American policy toward North Korea underwent drastic changes following election of Obama to Trump to Biden. And the similar kind of changes took place from President Lee Myung-bak, Park Geun-hye, and Moon Jae-in, and now Yoon Suk-yeol. So why would Kim Jong-un trust that he should make his irrevocable changes to his programs just because one current South Korean president says so. A series of 5-year plans, jigging here and jagging there, is not going to cut with Kim Jong-un, who has 40 years further to govern. The key to the German unification, according to ROK-US, one of the architects of the Germany's unification, was Ostpolitics. From 1969 to 1990, the conservative and the liberal of the West Germany followed the same policies toward the East. And they never changed, regardless who won the election. Everyone knew what it was, the plan was. The West Germans knew, East German government knew, the East German people knew, the USSR, US, France, and United Kingdom. All players knew because West Germany actively explained to all those parties. A trust was built, actions were taken, and everyone understood. ROK-US also told me that before there can be a serious North-South dialogue in Korea, first there has to be a South and South dialogue in which conservatives and progressives will have to work out every detail of the political implications and come up with a detailed bipartisan policy that can withstand elections and engage North Korea on scale of decades, not years. President Yoon's Thatcher's plan will be forgotten and go on the scrap heaps of history unless he can first organize a serious, sustainable policy dialogue between conservatives and progressive, one that ends up with a bipartisan agreement on a fundamental policy. If President Yoon can announce detailed bipartisan fundamental policies at the end of his term, and all the presidential candidates in 2027 pledges to support that plan, then President Yoon would have achieved something that will earn him a permanent place in Korean history. Thank you.
Spencer, thank you very much. Before I turn to Professor Delury, who I hope is going to refer to China as well, and as well as other, but I just want to make one comment and kind of just tag a question I'd like both Minister Im and Chairman, I can't call you Chairman Kim, can I? Spencer, might return to, because I'm struck by the fact that that Ambassador Im really emphasized the importance and the presence of, and I agree with this actually, of South Korean domestic consensus now and bipartisan consensus in many ways around the US-Korea alliance itself, and some questioning about the United States. And Spencer is highlighting what you see as a continued kind of divergence of political views within South Korea on the issue of North Korea. So I hope we can return to that discussion of the importance of that you've highlighted, and how you bridge that, and even if the gap is if the gap in reality is as big as it sometimes is made to seem in politics. But with that, I'm going to turn to John now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, thank you, Kathy, so much for the introduction, and to PCI for putting this together. Hopefully, there are already a lot of interesting topics out there, so I will try to bring in China, and hopefully I can be briefer and we can have a lot of rounds of discussion. But I would say, you know, I'm not trying to say I'm the youngest in the panel, but I'm certainly had the least time observing, you know, the alliance and the U.S.-Korea relationship than the rest of you all. In my experience, we met, I think that was 2010, Kathy, that's when I came to Korea. And I would actually say in the 12 years, I think the most almost dangerous moment for the alliance was 2018. And that's probably not surprising, but I'm not talking about Trump. I think that he was part of it, and his basic attitude toward Korea and kind of toward everyone was and would be again quite threatening to the alliance. But what I saw happening in 2018, because the peace diplomacy was actually getting somewhere, that created a really deep problem for the alliance. And actually, the most interesting discussions I had about it, about the security alliance and the military security piece, is not the whole thing by any means, but it is the core when we talk about the alliance. The most interesting but difficult discussions I engaged in were people trying to think through what happens to the alliance if we don't have the North Korean threat there. You know, it kind of loses its raison d'etre. And there was a way, and I was talking then, and others were envisioning a way to transform the alliance. But it was a real, almost existential challenge to it. Now, you could say, luckily for the alliance, that whole process totally fell apart, and we're now in a much more, I'm extremely pessimistic about the diplomacy that, Spencer, you were referring to. We can come back to that. But in a funny way, I think for the traditional alliance, actually, this is much easier to deal with. And in North Korea, that as it just did, declares, its nuclear policy, and while diplomatically everyone in the U.S. and in Washington and Seoul mouthed the words of "we must achieve denuclearization," the pessimism is so deep at this point that we're really going to get there. That in a way it actually reinforces the strength of the alliance. You don't have to ask, wait, why does this thing exist? It's pretty obvious to certainly South Koreans and I think to a lot of Americans. Where I would say, given this prompt, where the new challenge, I'm not sure North Korea will present a challenge. I don't think North Korea is going to invade South Korea and the alliance would handle it. And I don't think Kim Jong-un is going to give up his nuclear weapons. I think the peace peace train left the station, and so I don't think we're really going to return to that anytime soon at all. So I think what is now the new tension point in the alliance and challenge is China and how to manage China. It's no longer managing China's rise, it's managing China's power, its military power, diplomatic influence, and economic leverage and opportunity. And just to kick us off there, where I see the divergence right now, and I'm very curious how other panelists see this, in terms of almost combining both kind of foreign policy elites in both countries, the types that really think about this stuff, and then also bringing in sort of broader public attitudes in both sides. Where I see the difference is that the United States, certainly the foreign policy community, and I think more and more the public, has shifted from a economic first view of China and of China policy as ultimately centered on economic issues to a security first. We could call it American Songun if we wanted to be glib about this, that it is the military issues that come first now in the China policy. And economic dimensions are being rethought on the basis of their security implications. Whereas I see that trend here, but it's further behind, I would say significantly further behind. And I think still, I actually perceive bipartisan consensus on this. I don't see a huge difference between liberals and conservatives in South Korea, in that still no one wants to choose. Like, not having to choose is still the paradigm that folks sort of cling on to. So again, to be glib and use some of our North Korean jargon, it's like the Byungjin policy, right? Where South Korea wants simultaneous progress to continue with the economic opportunity of China. It's still a quarter of the South Korean economy, while enjoying the strong security relationship with the United States. And I don't know if those two postures, which are both kind of policies and I think largely public attitudes, I don't know if they can be reconciled. There are certain dramatic events that are talked about a lot more in the United States than they are here, like war in Taiwan, where it might bring it to a crisis point that I think could challenge, the alliance as much as the prospect of peace did in 2018. But short of that, I see it as something that's just kind of grinding away as a tension point and a real challenge. So why don't I stop there? Yeah, thank you, Kat.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you also brought up public attitudes in Korea. They obviously are very important in this country. And I mean, I've certainly noticed, again, Minister Im was talking about how approval ratings for the U.S. and the alliance have gone up so much over the last decade or so. They've gone the opposite way vis-a-vis China. And sometimes I feel like the Korean public is taking, at least in polls, a more hardline approach to China than, say, the political world or the diplomatic world in Korea is ready to, or maybe the business world is ready to do. But that's another question I'm kind of putting out there for later. Professor Son, Jie, over to you.
Hello. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I mean, I think my first Jeju Forum was the first Jeju Forum. So, and I was a part of the Foreign Correspondents Roundtable, I think, at the time. So it's always wonderful to be here and part of the Jeju Forum, and Jeju being representative of so much that Korea can be, I think. Within this discussion, may I introduce one more aspect of the ROK-US alliance? And let me put it this way. Recently, the National Security Advisor, the South Korea's foreign minister, South Korea's trade minister, all went to the US to meet their counterparts and came back. And what made the headlines in Korea was not North Korea. And I think that may be because what John just pointed out, there's nowhere to go. I mean, we're just not seeing movement, and therefore it's hard to make news or catch the South Korean imagination on that front. But the title, the headlines were all about how South Korean electric vehicles were being discriminated against in the United States because of a new act in which any electric vehicle that is not made in the United States will get their subsidies cut or drawn back. And South Korea, because Hyundai and Kia are the second biggest EV sellers in the United States, and of course South Korean battery makers, and the sort, that has made a lot of headlines in Korea. And so that, to me, symbolizes a new aspect of what could be, Minister Im talked about Misun Hyosun could be a new Misun Hyosun in the future. Because I see the shift, I see how U.S., China and South Korea, in its strategic ambiguity, as some people say, are not choosing one over the other. But overall, that focus has moved on in terms of the importance of Korea and South Korea into the economic and trade realm. And on that realm is where I think many in South Korea are feeling, have feelings that the United States are not quite aware of, I think, at the moment. And that is maybe where a challenge may be. If we are able to readjust our views and of each other, that may be where the opportunities are. But I think not recognizing the changes would definitely be something that is of concern, and that is also a bipartisan within South Korea perspective. I just read a recent editorial from the Chungang Daily in which they talked about, now that the ball being in the U.S. court, that the whole, the editorial, and Chungang not being one of those ultra conservative nor ultra liberal papers, we're talking about how this issue could shake the very foundation of U.S. ROK relations. How South Korea, because it feels like the U.S. has turned its back on Korea, and and it feels like South Korea feels like it is being stabbed in the back. These are literally the words that the editorial used. It reflects many of the articles and many of the news stories that you read in South Korea about this issue. They talk about what is happening. They talk about the efforts being made by South Koreans. They talk about, the fact that South Korea needs to make even more efforts to convey South Korea's concerns, to rectify the situation. And they also then end up, most of these articles end saying, and by the way, did you not know that Hyundai Motors, Kia Motors, SK have all pledged and are building factories in the United States. A recent statistic has shown that that this year or last year, South Korea is the country that has added the greatest number of new jobs in the United States, 35,000 new jobs in the United States. Do you not know this? And therefore, there is certainly a sense that that there is a feeling that in South Korea, especially when you read the media, which reflects some of the public and can lead the public to feel these things, that U.S. is not being fair, that they are asking South Korea to do one and then turning its back. It reminds you of a few other issues between the U.S. and South Korea and ROK that have influenced, and that are likely to influence relationship even more in the future. And I think that is something that we need to keep an eye on. And I feel that, especially in terms, of course, I think North Korea relations will always be a central part of the alliance. But I think as we move forward, and when the United States talks about, South Korea being a major strategic partner, they're talking more on this sense. And therefore, if they want South Korea to be a true strategic partner, then there has to be, I think, an adjustment of views about each other in order for that relationship to move forward in a more positive way. I think that I'll leave it there. But just one personal note, and a little plug for EY or North Korea, which everyone has talked about. I just met a recent, like 3 weeks ago, a group of North Korean young defectors, teenagers, who are last year in high school and they're going into university, and they had a campus tour of Ewha, and boys and girls, and although even boys are not allowed in, and I had a chance to meet them and talk to them, and they have endured unspeakable process in order to get to South Korea. And they are still, it's a struggle every day for them in South Korea. But they are just so positive about the future. It almost feels like, when you hit bottom, everything looks wonderfully up. And they were really eager to be able to be a part of Korea, to be a part of Korea's future, and to be a part of Korea's future, South Korea's future that involved North Korea, the home that they left behind and forced them to endure such things. They're talking about going back and being doctors and nurses and construction workers so that they can rebuild. And it just made me feel that it was something that that the Korean Peninsula, you know, could even be even a bigger and a better partner to the U.S. than it is now in the future. So that's it for me.
Jie, I hope you encourage the boys to go to Yonsei.
No, well, I said Shincheon's a great neighborhood.
Okay, that's close.
Yeah, your neighbors, right? Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, I appreciate that note of positivity, and it spurs me to say, too, that when I come back to Korea, and I haven't been able to come so often, obviously, over the last couple of years, that I always feel so energized here. That's a very superficial thing to say, and I especially feel energized when I meet young Koreans. Even when they are telling me why their futures are bleak, there's an energy here and a positivity, and also, as has already been pointed out, a positivity about the importance of the relationship, and that is encouraging. But with that, I'm struck, Jie, that you also kind of emphasize public reaction here to the U.S.-Korea relationship, and I think you're well, and also, you emphasized, and I've been struck by it too, how this reaction to the legislation that was passed called the Inflation Reduction Act and the IRA, and it's one of those things where I've discovered everyone, including the proverbial taxi driver, if you can find one, in Korea knows what the IRA is, and in the U.S., if you say it, people usually think it's their retirement plan, but that's only a joke for Americans. But no, the level of concern about it is very striking. Whereas both those stories, I guess, were in the press just as I was leaving the U.S. about a week ago to come here. No one, I think, in the U.S. outside of Washington, where certainly people were being visited by many say Koreans hearing the news. But the news, of course, was from North Korea, and it was Kim Jong-un saying to his assembled Congress and party, as I recall, that basically North Korea is prepared to engage in first use of nuclear weapons, including against South Korea, which was striking, and it was covered that way in the United States, and I've heard very little reaction to it here, which I think underscores some of the points that you all have made so far. But Sung-nam, I would like to turn to you, because I think, as I mentioned, that perhaps also this reaction we're seeing here in Korea to the complex economic security, supply chain, secure, all these new words we're having to learn, that comprises our relationship. But in this reaction, certainly it's about the substance, which is serious. It's about investment and doing business. But it seems to go beyond that to something you were alluding to, which is doubts about U.S. reliability and commitment, even before a presidential election. But you're...
Yeah, I think Professor Son made a very good point about the importance of economic security and technopolitics and all those things. But another obstacle or another challenge facing the Korea-US alliance in the coming years may not just be domestic politics I was talking about, but over-expectation about each other in our alliance relationship. I think IRA is a typical example. But we should also bear in mind the reality that there is always supposed to be a certain gap between what we could aspire in our alliance relationship and what we could achieve within the limits of domestic politics, because both Korea and the United States are democratic nations. But likewise, maybe another example of over-expectation in the coming years might be Korea's stance vis-a-vis China. Maybe Washington might want Seoul to become more hawkish, but as already alluded by John, Korea is basically pursuing a good relationship with China as well, because China is undeniably the most important trading partner for Korea at this point in time. And that fact maybe will continue for some years. So I think we should try to avoid over-expectation about each other as an ally, so that we can nurture the alliance in the coming years. Having said that, I'd like to touch upon the point made by Chairman Kim Spencer with regard to the importance of continuity, policy continuity vis-a-vis North Korea. He was referring to the case of Germany, talking about the Ostpolitik. About 10 years ago, I was serving as a political minister in Beijing, and whenever I was having a conversation with my Chinese counterparts, they used to tell me, if Seoul and Washington could engage Pyongyang in a constructive dialogue and diplomacy for 20 years, then you guys could achieve denuclearization. But that's impossible for a country like Korea or the United States, because we are democratic nations. And the fact is that democratic nations are in a disadvantageous position than a country like the DPRK, China, or Russia, because their leadership is basically more or less permanent, while we change like every 4 years, every 8 years, or every 5 years. Well, if we want to secure effective foreign and security policy, then we should secure continuity, as emphasized by Spencer. And the starting point for securing that kind of continuity in our foreign policy should be having a very open-minded and less politically motivated dialogue among liberals and conservatives, especially in Korea. And I think the point mentioned by Spencer should be really borne in mind by every intellectual in Korea. And last but not least, with regard to the point made by John about China, I think the biggest challenge facing us, facing Washington, is the lack of a clear vision beyond containing China. We all understand Washington is now focused upon containing China. We all understand Washington's policy vis-a-vis China is American version of what? Sungun, military first. But what happens after that? And again, about 10 years ago, the Chinese vision for the world was, for China's future was, peaceful rise to power. In Chinese, 和平崛起. And I used to ask my Chinese counterparts, okay, what happens when China rises to power? What will you provide? What will China provide the international community with what kind of public goods? And they have not had any clear-cut answer. Likewise, now we understand Washington's position. But if Washington is interested in leading the world into a better world, then we should be provided with a vision beyond containment of China. Thank you.
Yeah, well said. This is not a hub and spoke system, so you should feel free to talk to each other. And in about 8 minutes, I'm going to turn to the audience for questions and comments. John, did you want to?
I've got so many now. We have so many wonderful sort of boxes open. And actually, I don't have a strong view on it, but one more I feel we at least should open up and see what's in there is Japan. I don't think any of us brought that up, but I mean, that's just a perennial issue in the alliance. And I'd sort of be curious what others, maybe that's a form of a question. You know, my sense now is that this current administration's soul's like way out on its skis trying to improve things with Tokyo, and Tokyo seems to be enjoying their leverage and not budging a lot. And it's another one of those you know, issues where I think, like GA's point that was so well made about the coverage. As you were describing that, I was realizing, yeah, I was reading about it in Korean papers every day. I don't think I read a single New York Times article. Obviously, it's not going to be front page news, but like not even a passing mention of the fact that like Koreans are really upset about this, you know. And there's plenty of stories about the bill, but nothing about that. I mean, I think Japan is another one that is just can be the big topic at next year's Jeju Forum, because we saw a version of this with Park Geun-hye when the governments tried too hard, and of course the Obama administration facilitated that and was very proud of how they facilitated that. The South Korean public was not in the loop, you know, and that is something where again it can the scaffolding can kind of fall apart quickly. And I think it sort of goes to your point, Mr. Lim, really good about expectations and keeping expectations down. So maybe that's where I put it right now, but I'd be curious about others. I worry expectations are higher than where the parties are, and that could also hurt the relationship. And then the last thing, just quickly, I completely agree about this need for China to have a vision of once the century of humiliation is over and once it is not rising but it's risen, what is that positive vision? I think they have some, they have certain parts of the argument that they've made about AIIB, and sometimes they do things like BRI and we say, oh, actually we don't like that. But still, I completely agree that China, it's not just the United States. Obviously, you look at South Korea, South Koreans are not persuaded. You look around the region, you look at Europe, I mean, the opinion toward China is sour pretty much globally. This is not a US agenda. So I think China, the Chinese government has a huge problem that they have to face. But so is the United States. And Jessica Chen Weiss wrote a great piece in Foreign Affairs, a long piece, precisely making this point in terms of US-China policy. We can't just fixate on what's wrong with China. We have to figure out what we stand for and what we're doing. And I would commend that article as a very clear call for going beyond containment. And that includes a lot of dialogue with China and a lot of working together with China on the US part, which is, I think, the kind of thing South Koreans would like. Even South Koreans who answer those polls and are sour, they still want the security situation to be stable. They still want to do as much business as possible. I respect the lack of kind of a cowboy attitude in South Korea toward how you handle the China piece.
I'd like to add something to Minister Lim said. A couple of things that I'd like to add on to. One, I appreciate your positive, affirmative attitude toward the consistent policies that will be needed between two different factions of South Korean political force. And you also mentioned that speaking to Chinese, they said it will be at least 20 years of consistency. Well, I would like to add something more to what you have said. Bill Perry, the former defense minister, defense secretary of the United States, had one time told me when I asked him what was US government's position when East and West came to be unified. And he remembered Volker Lue very clearly, and he was a big factor. He was a known person. There was an incredible trust that US defense community had on Volker. And if it hadn't been him personally, probably would not have gotten as much support. And when I told Volker that, he had this very amusing smile in his face and said, that's what we thought also. So that was assured. I often, when I come to Korea on occasions, I usually will write a op-ed to be published so that it can be part of talking points while I'm here. And so this time, when I was asked to also speak in this session, I took part of that op-ed. And so when I wrote it, I sent that to Volker Lue, our former board member, and I said, what do you think of this? And he said, Spencer, I'd like to add something to you. I used to say this thing to you 10 years ago, and now you have a bigger challenge. He said, when Germans were going through this, there was a big water movement, oceans of movement. EU was accepting United Germany, which was a big deal. Soviet was ready to change their military first attitude toward the world, Europe, and lots of little things, but overall, instead of confrontation, working together, living together attitude. Well, now, Spencer, you have a situation in Peninsula. Will China and Russia take the same attitude? Because what they've been saying, they've been doing recently is definitely not. So that reminds me that when the Chinese were thinking 20 years, I think it's maybe 40 years. It's much harder. And then we cannot just wait for the water to change, just like Germany's did once they made that decision, and they went around to their neighbors and everyone what that program meant, so that over 21 years period, they sold that to the neighbors, and they all bought into it. Now, will Korea be able to do that for the 40 years? Thank you.
I'm not sure Korea can. But I do agree that we do need a uniform, or it's not uniform, but I think a consistent thinking and policy, because I think for the outside world, it's difficult to gauge what the South Korean position in this is, because we flip-flop so much. Also, talking about, reflecting on John's comments about the change that South Korea sees in the U.S. Going back to that infamous editorial, the final part of that is, after we talk, the editorial talks about the indignation and the anger, or it's not just anger. It feels, as I said, it feels like being stabbed in the back. What is the word? But betrayal. Yeah, betrayal. The final paragraph is, okay, if that's the case and that's how the world is working, why don't we look at, the subsidies we're giving, South Korea is giving to U.S. EV vehicles in South Korea. Isn't it time that we rethink that? Now, this goes against everything in terms of free trade, the capitalism that made Korea, that we learned from the United States. That is the basic value that we believe that the United States portrays and symbolizes. And I think that is maybe one reason why, for some Koreans, the difference between the United States and China becomes less and less. And it's like, why do you want us to choose? I mean, it may be starkly visible to those within the United States, but for people or countries outside of the United States, especially in this part of the world, and especially as this conflict between the U.S. and China develops into areas and develops into something that you've talked about in terms of doing anything, everything is okay, as long as it contains as China, it makes the differences less and less, I think. I mean, I can see it reflected among the Korean media, and especially as they talk about this U.S.-China conflict.
Can I add one thing just to that? When you were talking about the subsidies, a flip side of that is the tariffs. And there was an earlier version of what you were describing in terms of all the China tariffs, that Trump started, but that then Biden largely kept. Korean firms were getting hit, and that's still a big concern, is Korean, operations in China, that they get swept up in the tariffs. It's kind of the flip side of the same coin of who gets subsidies, and who gets hit with tariffs. Meanwhile, the United States puts itself out there as rule-based order and free trade, But here from a Korean perspective, it's like, wait, what? Hang on a second.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a serious issue. I do think that we will kind of work this out. But I think what you have in the Biden administration, we're doing something, that I guess people call industrial policy. The U.S. didn't used to do industrial policy, kind of figuring it out. But Korea always kind of has that risk, right, of being a little bit overlooked, right? People are thinking about China, people think about domestic politics being overlooked, and it has an enormous reaction here. I'm just glad we're arguing now about EVs, having ridden in a Hyundai EV to the hotel yesterday and not, I don't know, I won't mention other things. I'm going to turn to the floor now for anyone who'd like to pose a question or a comment to what you've heard to our panelists. If you do wish to, please raise your hand. A microphone will appear, and please introduce yourself. We have a fast runner coming to you.
Thank you for the fruitful discussion. My name is Ryosuke Sawayama. I'm a program officer at an intergovernmental organization here in Korea. My question, and I know we've opened up a bunch of boxes and I hesitate to open up another one, but my question is related to the pursuit of cooperation with China on non-traditional security threats. So we've talked about like this South Korean version of a Pyeongjin policy, or potential Washington wanting to make Seoul more hawkish. And so it's been for this discussion, it seems to me that's pretty clear that it'll be hard for Seoul to pursue close economic ties with China while also keeping its close security ties with the United States. And so we've had this discussion about trade and the intersection of that with traditional security. So from the work I do, it seems to me that Korea not only does it want to pursue close economic ties with China, but also there's a rationale for Korea to pursue cooperation with China on non-traditional security threats. And so that includes like responding to natural disasters, there's the pandemic, there's also like an aging and decreasing population. And it makes sense for Korea to cooperate with China and not having to choose that between the United States. And so my question is, how do you think, if any, are the effects of the ROK-US alliance on Korea's potential pursuit of that kind of cooperation? Thank you.
I'll say something quickly, and then I do think that there's room for that, and I think that, again, there's still a debate in the United States about just how hard to make the China policy. And there are plenty of influential voices who are arguing for things like that, which also exist in US-China context. And there are still strong arguments out there that we need those, we should maintain those, we should expand those. So, when something's already happening in a US-China context, it does make it hard for the US to say, oh, but others can't do that. South Korea can't do that. So I think there's room for that. I just don't know how far it will go. I mean, if we look at COVID, there was not huge cooperation between Korea and China in the pandemic response. That would have been a moment to really show how non-traditional security threats, countries can come together, but I don't think we really saw it.
Let me just add a couple of points. Number one, I think regardless of the alliance between Korea and the US, the kind of the cooperation you are talking about is possible between China and any country. For instance, I believe Washington and Beijing have created a working group on climate change at the Alaska high-level meeting. And we are also in talks with Beijing well before the US-China rivalry. We are talking about how to overcome the air pollution coming from the Chinese mainland to the Korean peninsula. So those cooperation will be possible regardless of the kind of the alliance framework. But having said that, I also would like to emphasize that while Korea pursues the good relationship with both China and the US, but at the same time, I think the Korean business community has come to the recognition that putting every egg in one basket is very dangerous. I think that's why many Korean companies are now looking at Southeast Asia as an alternative for China, to be a production base. And actually, many transfers are taking place from mainland China to various Southeast Asian countries. So don't take the point I just made that we will try to have the good relationship with everybody, with anybody permanently. It goes up and down.
All right, while you're thinking there, I'm going to raise, we haven't touched on Taiwan yet, and in particular, I'm interested in, again, since we focus very much on South Korean attitudes and thinking about it, but Taiwan is a word I didn't hear very often when I lived here a decade ago. Now we hear about it all the time, and there's obviously huge security implications for South Korea of whatever happens in this region. But there's also a very complicated economic relationship and competition as well as cooperation. I'm just be interested in some thoughts about how that affects, is that a challenge in the US ROK alliance?
Well, go ahead, Jay. I was just going to say that, I think as the way you frame it gets at, Kathy, and I try to emphasize this to American interlocutors to appreciate how sort of cold the relationship is. Like, there's not a lot of love there. It was a very harsh break, even though pretty much everyone did it, but South Korea switched recognition relatively late, and it was a big loss for Taiwan. And Taiwan was very upset about that. There were no direct flights from the Taiwanese side for a decade. And I've seen that a little bit. I led a student group from Yonsei to Taiwan National University, and it was fascinating. The students had an amazing half-day conference, but it was really like complete strangers talking to one another, And Spence, you would have loved it because they were comparing cross-straits relations with inter-Korean relations and civic nationalism versus ethnic nationalism. And they had this wonderful conversation, but it was really like they had never talked before. And the linkages really, in my observation experience, are quite frail. So I think that's important to understand. It may help explain why, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, doesn't merit a break from a vacation when she comes on this Taiwan-related trip. I think that is part of it, because there's not this undertow of connection with Taiwan, and obviously South Koreans are going to identify with the democracy and kind of the underdog. But in terms of that particular bilateral relationship, it's starting from very, very little. Having had a very rich history prior to that in close connections, economic and security, it really dropped to zero since '92, in my observation.
But do you see it being built at all?
Not too much, and there's a lot of competition. Again, in terms of news coverage, Taiwan is like the big rival. TSMC and Samsung are slugging it out. So it really doesn't fit the narrative that you get in US.
TSMC only makes the news when it's like, they're pushing ahead of Samsung. But there is, that relationship, it made news because, of Russia, in terms of when Russia, and the Ukraine war started. The people in the region were all looking to see. In this region, the effect it would have on the Chinese relationship with Taiwan, and would that embolden China to up its game in the region. And I think that is one thing that that a lot of people here are watching and still watching very closely. But overall, but I think though, it has, as John was saying, it has the possibility of blossoming, because I think with China being so closed, I see it, as John said, this was a few years ago, but recently more young South Koreans are actually picking Taiwan as a destination to visit. And so when that happens, I think there's a possibility of renewed recognition about Taiwan. And so hopefully something that will develop in this aspect as well.
Kathy, in our audience, we have an expert. Ray Burkhardt is sitting there, I see. Ray, could you weigh in, please?
Yeah, Ambassador Burkhardt was the U.S., well, he should explain it because I got the words wrong. It's a diplomatic language so delicate that I hesitate to wade in. So.
Being a New Yorker, I'm not very delicate. I was the head of the fake corporation that is in fact part of the U.S. government which managed relations with Taiwan. First in Taipei and later in Washington. For 2 years in Taipei and for 10 and a half years in the Washington office. And continue to actually be quite active on the subject. But do I get extra pay for now being brought in like this? Okay. It's always been, you know, I worked here in Korea for 3.5 years also as a deputy in the embassy in the Sharjah. So I think I like John Delury's description. I mean, it's an anomaly almost. You know, there are two places which, you know, strong players in the world economy, strong players in the region. But I was here in '92 when the relations were broken, and it was really painful business. The head of the Taiwan office was a good friend, and he was just you know, he was gone. He was expelled, and it was sort of historically had a lot of interesting sort of undertones because the office that the Republic of China government occupied was the same office that Yuan Shikai had used when he was the Qing dynasty's representative here. And there was furniture and all kinds of accoutrements from Yuan Shikai in the office, which all was abandoned and handed over to the PRC. So that was very, you know, sort of added to the painful atmosphere of it. I mean, to be very blunt about it, we're lucky that serious contingency planning for a Taiwan emergency would not depend on our military presence in Korea. But there are circumstances in which you can imagine if things happen to our bases in Japan or if there was problems further south where you might want to use Kunsan and Osan, the planes, or you might want to need them for rescue operations, you might want to use the medical facilities there and so forth. But it's pretty hard to really think through those kinds of plans because there would be zero cooperation from South Korea at this point on that. I think but we're at a point where we have to, you know, part of the whole deterrence situation dealing with the Taiwan issue is a lot of very serious planning for what we might have to do. The Japanese, we are seeing being much more open toward those kind of discussions than they were before. But there's absolutely no possibility of such discussion with Korea. So it's quite a stark difference. But of course, there's always the possibility that when things really do get dramatic, that there would be sudden decisions that would be impossible for a Korean government to take without the drama of the sudden situation. Hopefully we'll never learn that.
I'd like to follow up on the last point just made by Ambassador Burkhardt. Partly because I served in Taiwan for 2 years, from 1998 until the year 2000. But anyhow, with regard to the possible contingency in the Taiwan Strait, I'd like to bring your attention to the political understanding, the only existing political understanding between Korea and the United States made in the year 2006 by the then Foreign Minister Ban Ki-moon and Secretary Condi Rice regarding the strategic flexibility of the US forces in Korea. To make a long story short, Korea has made it clear its respect for the strategic flexibility of the US forces in Korea, but it should be not against the will of the Korean people. So it has two different goals in the same basket. Okay, you guys can use your forces on the Korean Peninsula maybe for a contingency, but not against the will of the Korean people. So that kind of seemingly contradictory modus vivendi clearly shows how sensitive the Korean people can be about the possibility of being entrapped in the alliance in the case of a contingency outside the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us of that very difficult negotiation. But even if I can say, before you get to a contingency, meaning a aggression by China against Taiwan, and which classic, where South Korea doesn't want to have to choose, but China will be forced into choices, and is already in some ways being forced into small signals all the way along as the debate continues in the United States about the move from strategic ambiguity to strategic certainty, as we see more and more high-ranking Americans visit Taiwan and so on and so forth. So yeah, very difficult. We have only about 8 minutes left. I'm going to turn to the audience one more time to see if anyone would like to raise an issue that we've not, I'd like to discuss a bit more. I'm just going to kind of maybe go down the line here and have people maybe then wrap up as they like, but I'm going to suggest one more question which you may or may not want to respond to, and that is, Minister Im talked about too high expectations, over expectations, sometimes perhaps on the part of Korea on the United States, and I'm worried too about some of the challenges I think the U.S. faces politically, and I hope we work our way through them. But I'm intrigued by this new catchword, and there's always catchwords with new presidents in both countries, of Korea as a global pivotal state. And I just wonder, does global pivotal state, and I'm not sure what's in the mind of the drafters and the presidents, maybe they're figuring it out, is that a South Korea that has more autonomy or less autonomy, if you like, within the alliance? Or maybe autonomy is not the right word, but is more, and is it also over-expecting? I'm trying to think of other pivotal states. I mean, a pivotal state may have to do things like get more involved in Europe than it might want to, in ways that it might not want to, for example. So I'm just curious about that. Maybe a slightly provocative question to wrap up with. So maybe we'll start here and come back down this way.
Well, I may not be the right person to answer the question because I was not in the Yoon Suk-yeol campaign. But having said that, I'd like to point out the fact that while the candidate Yoon Suk-yeol was proposing global pivot state, Governor Lee Jae-myung was proposing global leading nation. So both candidates were talking about something global. And Kathy was linking that with the autonomy in the alliance or not, but I would rather read that signal, the emphasis upon global, as an intention on the part of the political leadership to do more globally, to do something for the global village in a more proactive manner. I think we can do more in terms of ODA, maybe more in terms of humanitarian assistance, and maybe we can do more in terms of knowledge sharing as well. And I do hope and believe Korea or Jeju Island can become a northeastern version of a city like Singapore or Brussels, hosting many international organizations and secretaries for the multilateral cooperation and so on and so forth. And maybe this might be my last turn to speak. I just would like to make 2 additional points. Number one, with regard to Japan, which was briefly referred to by John and Kathy. I think Japan is very, very important for Korea very, very important partner. And I have lived and studied in Tokyo for 1 year. And after living for 1 year in Tokyo, my conclusion about the Korea-Japan relationship is, we are like cousins. There are so many similar things, but there are so many different things. So the beginning point, the starting point of our relationship should be the intellectual humbleness to recognize that we are different. Maybe on that basis, we can overcome, those seemingly insurmountable problems, not that rapidly, but step by step. That's number one. And number two, I appreciate Chairman Kim for telling me that it may be 40 years, not 20 years. I appreciate that very much. And I also understand Professor Son's point that Koreans may not be able to do that. That might be the reality. But as a diplomat of 40 career, I'd like to be an optimist. Koreans can change. And I do hope Koreans can do that maybe over the period of 40 years, so that after 40 years, when we are all gone, our children can talk about the brighter future for Korea's diplomacy. Thank you.
Well, Kathy, you asked about GPS. I thought of it as the GPS thing, like the on our phones. So, which that tells you the quickest way to get to where you want to go. But I guess you have a different interpretation of like where this government wants to go, which is to be pivotal, to be globally important, whether you call it, impactful and pivotal. And I don't know, to me it seems like another one of those slogans that'll come and go, and more aspirational, It's a very interesting question you pose, like, does that give you more or less room in terms of the alliance, wiggle room? I think that if there's one, maybe it's my closing observation, this has been such an interesting discussion. I've learned a lot from everyone, including the intervention from the floor was wonderful with the person who was there in '92, Raymond. But, I think kind of like with keeping low expectations, this alliance, we always sort of cheer it on, kachi kapshida and rah rah. As those of us who are closer to it know, there's a lot of problems, and we're just in a new phase of them, and there will be another phase of them. And both sides have to have a lot of mutual understanding and leave wiggle room. To some extent, I think you can make an argument to Koreans, to be my American side now, like, give Joe Biden a break. Like, do you know what's going on over there? Yeah, he needs to get this bill through, and there's going to be stuff, just like Korea has nationalist economic policies all the time, because it's good for the Korean economy, it's good for Korean companies. So now the US has to do it too. Desperate times call for desperate measures. So, and Americans, I think, are going to have to leave a lot of wiggle room for Koreans in their relationship, in particular, I think, with China. So I'll close there.
Yeah. And Ambassador Im, your talk about lifetime, it reminds me of a joke I used to do when anyone asked, do you think you will see a united Korean peninsula in your lifetime? And my standard answer always would be, it depends on how long you think I will live. I hope so. I hope that we live to see that. In terms of, the pivotal state, I also think it's another slogan, but I sense a little bit of a shift in paradigm in a way, because I think, I was at another meeting with the leaders of the Democratic Alliance, the U.S. and the organizations, and they did a stop and visit tour in Korea, and they emphasized that the ideology of the Democratic Alliance between the U.S. and an ROK, And not only that we were aligned, but South Korea needed to almost carry the torch. And I feel a little, and I think I'm not the only one, that this kind of message in terms of South Korea, in part because how South Korea has evolved and developed as, a poster child of what the U.S., represented in the world in terms of the pull that the U.S. democracy had throughout the years. And so I think in terms of South Korea being in a position in which it can step up and be a leader is something that is talked about and among and said to Koreans. And I think in a way that's very scary because we've been sort of it's like we've fought so hard just to get recognized as a country. We're not North Korea. I mean, that's what we were fighting against. And now, we not only in the political sense, but look at culture. Look at Parasite. Now we got Emmys. The Squid Game, and in terms of Asian American culture, all these Korean, and it's like almost as if, almost overnight, we are being almost in a position that we must lead or, serve as a change, a momentum of change. And it's very, that's a heavy responsibility. And I think that is something that is going to weigh on Korea for a while. And I don't know if that will give us more wiggle room or not within the relationship with the U.S., but it's something that is going to be with us for a while.
When we talk about alliance, Korea, U.S., two different party, and the similarities of two countries is comfortable, but I think the difference is structural, as our friend Don Gregg used to say. The second point is when we talk about something like alliance, with the exception of Minister Lim and Kathy Stevens, we are all private sector people. We are not a government. And the private sector participation of the Jeju Forum itself 22 years ago when Don Gregg, William Perry and Moon Jae-in and I sat on an airport, we got to do something for this island. And the idea of Jeju Peace Forum came. And 22 years later, look where we are. So there's a private sector participation that is necessary. Not only the government to government, the private sector can do as much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I have to say, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but this has been very thought-provoking and even inspiring. I really do sincerely thank all of you for your thoughts and your commitment. I thank the audience, and I hope you'll join me in expressing appreciation to our great panel here today and to the Jeju Peace Forum.
Thank you very much to our wonderful moderator and panelists for what was a very interactive and engaging session. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the session titled The ROK-US Alliance, Changes, Challenges, Opportunities. We have many more sessions planned throughout the next 3 days. We look forward to your active participation and interest. Thank you.